So we are going to go on with our talk about the motor system, talking about motor neurons. So motor neurons that are commonly referred to as lower motor neurons. Oh, here we go. They're the only neurons that convey signals directly to extrafusal and intrafusal skeletal muscle fibers. So there are those two different types of lower motor neurons, and each one is innervating different fibers in the muscle. But both of the types have their cell bodies in the ventral horn of the spinal cord. So we talked about the somatosensory neuron cell bodies. The first order neurons have their cell body in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, while the lower motor neurons have their cell bodies in the ventral horn of the spinal cord. So the lower motor neuron axons leave the spinal cord via the ventral root. So the cell bodies whose axons project to a single muscle are clustered in what we call motor pools, which sounds like cars, but there you go. They're motor pools. The anteriorly located pools innervate extensors, and the posterior located pools innervate flexors. And when we say anterior and posterior, we mean anterior and posterior in the spinal cord. So you see these in the diagram, those little purple blobs. Those are muscle pools going out the ventral nerve roots to innervate skeletal muscles. Kind of neat, right? So they're organized together because a lot of times the muscles work together. So when we're talking about flexion or extension or different things, it's usually not one muscle. So even though in kinesiology we would talk about an individual muscle and what its action was, in the real world, muscles do not work independently. So myotomes are groups of muscles that are innervated by a single spinal nerve. So remember, dermatomes was the cutaneous area that was innervated by a single spinal nerve. Myotomes are groups of muscles innervated by a single spinal nerve. So we have the two different types of there's a table in the book that talks about which movements are associated with specific myotomes, and so you can use those muscle testing of those individual things to see what myotome is affected in an injury. So it's on page 248. You can check that out. So the two types of motor neurons, alpha and gamma, they both have their cell bodies in the ventral horn of the spinal cord. Their axons all leave via the ventral root, just like all of them, and travel through the spinal nerve. And then they travel through the peripheral nerve to reach skeletal muscle. So alpha motor neurons have large cell bodies and large myelinated axons. The axons of alpha motor neurons project to extrafusal skeletal muscle, branching into numerous terminals as they approach the muscle. So you see the nerve root going out, and it splits into all these different little things that's going to find a neuromuscular junction on the muscle to release acetylcholine to activate those muscle fibers. And it's, at the neuromuscular junction, it's always an excitatory response. So normally an alpha motor neuron releases enough acetylcholine that all of the muscle fibers it innervates contract together as a team. So the gamma motor neurons, they are medium-sized myelinated axons, and those all project to intrafusal fibers in the muscle spindle. Okay, so we'll talk about why that's important. They work together. Gamma and alpha work together. So during most movements, the alpha and gamma motor neuron systems function simultaneously, and this is called alpha-gamma coactivation. And the reason this is important is because when the two contract together, it maintains the stretch sensitivity of the muscle spindle which is that intrafusal fiber, when the extrafusal muscle fibers are contracted. Okay, so we want to maintain the stretch sensitivity of the muscle in order to protect the muscle fiber. So the excitatory signals that are sufficient to stimulate alpha motor neurons also stimulate gamma motor neurons to the spindle fibers in the same muscle. The alpha-gamma coactivation occurs because most sources of input to the alpha motor neurons have collaterals that project to gamma motor neurons. So gamma motor neurons, because they have smaller cell bodies, they require less excitation to reach threshold than do alpha motor neurons. So they work together to maintain the correct muscle length. So a motor unit is considered the alpha motor neuron and the muscle fibers it innervates. So whenever an alpha motor neuron is activated, acetylcholine is released at all of the neurons, neuromuscular junctions, and all the muscle fibers innervated by that neuron contract together. Motor units are classified as slow twitch and fast twitch. Remember, we've talked about this before. And it depends on the speed of the muscle contraction and the response to a single electrical shock. The neuron innervating the muscle determines the twitch characteristics of muscle fibers. So smaller diameter, slower conducting alpha motor neurons innervate the slow twitch fibers, and larger diameter, faster conducting alpha motor neurons innervate fast twitch fibers. That makes sense, doesn't it? So slow twitch fibers constitute the majority of muscle fibers in postural and slow contracting muscles. So the classic example of the slow twitch fiber is the soleus muscle. Has primarily slow twitch fibers, and it's active in standing. It's active in standing and in walking. And the gastroc has more fast twitch muscle fibers than the soleus, producing fast, powerful movements like sprinting. So in most movements, the slow twitch muscle fibers are activated first because the small cell bodies of the slow conducting alpha motor neurons depolarize before the larger cell bodies of the faster motor neurons. So the slow twitch muscle fibers continue to contribute during faster actions as the fast twitch units are recruited. So the order of recruitment from smaller to larger alpha motor neurons is called Henneman's size principle. So we get those slow twitch, smaller fibers activated first, and then the fast twitch, larger ones activated second. The order of recruitment can be modified depending on the task and the phase during human walking and running. So it's really up to our control systems, which we'll talk about a little bit later, to decide how it's going to do that. So motor units also vary in the number of muscle fibers innervated by a single neuron. So the gastroc has approximately 2,000 muscle fibers innervated by each alpha motor neuron. But some other muscles, like the muscles around the eyes, have about 2.5 muscle fibers per alpha motor neuron because you need more precise control of your eye muscles than you do of your gastroc. Makes sense, right? So the motor unit is that single alpha motor neuron and the muscle fibers that it innervates. The activity of a motor unit depends on the convergence of information from peripheral sensors, spinal connections, descending motor tracts onto the cell body and dendrites of the alpha motor neuron. So lots of stuff going on with an individual motor unit. Pretty cool. So spinal cord coordination, there's neural communication within the spinal cord that contributes to coordination of movement. So all of the processing is not going on, it's not only going on in the cerebral cortex, there's also processing that goes on in the spinal cord. And in the next section, we'll talk about spinal region motor function.